Intel have just released their brand new KabyLake line of CPUs, which can only mean one thing: a load of new motherboards. So today on the Z270 chipset, I'm going to be reviewing the ASUS Maximus IX Hero. Does this satisfy all of the prosumer needs? Let's find out. I'm going to start off this review by initially praising ASUS on the overall unboxing experience, as you are welcomed into the Republic, so to speak. From the vast array of included accessories to the well thought out instruction manual, it's clean, nice and high end from the outset. Enough of that though, let's take a look around, starting with all the connectors, buttons and slots on this board. Let's take a look at the rear I/O, one of the best I've seen. It sports clear CMOS and bias flashback buttons at the top, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth as we work down, as well as HDMI and a DisplayPort connector. 4 USB 2 ports, 4 USB 3 ports, Ethernet, gigabit of course, 2 USB 3.1 10 gigabit ports, one being Type A, the other the much smaller Type C. Audio connections are also thorough, with 5 3.5mm surround sound audio connectors and an optical output. There's a grand total of 8 4-pin PWM fan headers, 3 at the top of the board, allowing for a dual radiator and a pump to be plugged in. There's also 3 down the right hand side, 1 above and 2 below the SATA connections. These are ideal for front intake fans. There's another at the bottom if you have a fan next to your power supply, and 1 more below the I/O shield for rear exhaust fan. All of the fan headers, bar an extra one on the right hand side of the board, are the more versatile 4-pin style, which also support 3-pin fans. Nice. Also at the top is the 8-pin CPU power connection, an Rgb header, more on that later, the Q code which allows easy debugging, it will show a number which is relative then to an error in the motherboard manual, and the life-saving memo K button, helping to bypass memory issues which may prevent the initial boot of the PC. Down the side is the 3D printing mount, also more on that later, the 24-pin motherboard power connector, the first USB 3.1 header I've seen for cases that in the future will have USB 3.1 connections on the front panel, 6 SATA 3 6 gigabit connections and a water cooling water flow connection. Along the bottom we have the usual array of front panel connectors, but with sadly only 1 USB 3 header and 1 USB 2 header here. This isn't a huge negative, as most won't need 2 of these, it would just be nice to have. The rear I/O does however have plenty of USB 3 ports. Other connections at the bottom here include a second Rgb header, a thermal sensor connector which will allow you to connect thermal probes here for monitoring system temperatures through the ASUS software suite, a Republic of Gamers extension connector and a Thunderbolt connector, which is great to see. The array of buttons at the bottom of the board also flaunt its high-end spec, with power on start button, slow mode switch, retry button, safe boot and reset buttons. The start button is particularly useful, especially for those of you water cooling and also if you kind of misplug in your front panel connectors. And whilst I'd hope you'd never need to use the safe boot and reset buttons and stuff like that, they're a lifesaver if and when you need them. The board of course sports the RJ1151 socket for KabyLake Z270 CPUs, 4 colour coded RAM DIMMs, each supporting a maximum of a 16GB unbuffered DIMM each, and PCIe slots in the following order: X1, X8, X1, X8, X1 and X4, all of these being on the PCIe 3.0 standard. There is also 2 PCIe M.2 slots, one for full length and one slightly shortened, along with an M.2 header for a Wi-Fi card at the rear I/O. Given the restricted amount of PCIe lanes on Intel's Consumer 1151 platform, you won't be able to use all these connectors at once though, although the Z270 chipset allows for the most PCIe lanes. If you're using a single GPU, it will run at full bandwidth X16, and if you're using 2, both will run at X8, giving support for both NVIDIA SLI and AMD Crossfire. Talking of NVIDIA's SLI, ASUS actually include a hard PCB high bandwidth SLI bridge in all black with a white Republic of Gamers logo, an inclusion more manufacturers need to provide on higher end boards. The latest generation of NVIDIA GPUs are kind of the first to get close to using 8x of bandwidth. So if you happen to be using 2 GPUs, don't worry too much about this reduced bandwidth that can go through the slot. As I listed the connections and features on this board, you may have noticed something aside from the pure quantity. ports you may not have heard of. One of the flagship features of this board is its RGB functionalities. Technology in 2016 went RGB mad, and this board continues that trend into 2017. Oh, Happy New Year, by the way. Alongside the LED customizable Republic of Gamers logo on the heatsink for the Z270 chipset and the Maximus IX logo above the I/O, there are also two Rgb headers. Each of these support 50/50 LED 12-volt strips, which can be sourced cheaply on Amazon, linked in the description below. I love that these headers can take the more powerful strips, as something like NZXT Hue Plus dedicated LED lighting box can only cope with the lower voltage 5-volt strips, which are harder to source and often length dependent, not as bright. ASUS recommends keeping the length of each of these within 2 meters for maximum brightness. And this is where it gets really clever. ASUS have a software suite which takes advantage of their aura lighting, as they're calling it. You can actually sync the lighting of the strips to the lighting colours and effects you choose for the Republic of Gamers and Maximus logo on the motherboard to create a much better looking, more cohesive system. But it doesn't stop there. If you use an ASUS GPU with this aura technology, I'm using their 1070 in this example, you can sync all three up: LED strips, board LEDs and the GPU. Add in an ASUS aura keyboard and aura capable mouse, and you guessed it, more syncing. Not only is this super convenient, it works great for their bottom line too, encouraging you to purchase more ASUS components. Not only financially clever, but also very aesthetically pleasing. Another thing that clearly works great on their bottom line is the pricing of this board. Whilst I don't have any official figures from ASUS, we're looking between the £225 to £275 mark for this board. It isn't cheap. Don't get me wrong though, there is no doubt this is a high-end product and clearly one aimed at the enthusiast prosumer market. In comparison to this board's competition, it certainly isn't pricing itself out the market, and there is certainly a target demographic to which that board may appeal. The key thing for you watching is to figure out if that is indeed you. Great features and functionality come at a price. Other features that help warrant this price are the inclusion of things like 3D printing support, with included 3D printing mounts. If you have a 3D printer, which aren't cheap, the chances are you have a bit more cash to splash on a motherboard. This 3D printing will certainly allow much more flexibility and customization in the motherboard if you are lucky enough to have a 3D printer. Now let's talk about performance. Given that this board is based on the highest end Z270 chipset, the feature set is inevitably larger, and because of the greater overclocking support, there are typically more and better designed heatsinks in a better layout to facilitate for that overclocking. This motherboard is no exception. Intel's KabyLake CPUs overclock like chips I've never really tested before. So much so this motherboard has the option within the BIOS to overclock the CPU to a whopping 5 GHz. Absolutely mental. Whenever using the well thought out BIOS, I'd recommend to avoiding the ASUS Easy, more dumbed down mode in order to properly take advantage of the large feature set. I managed to get my i7 7700K to 4.7 GHz with no instability issues, but this board takes all the hard work out of it. A program ASUS have been praised for some time is their Easy Tuner software. In short, it takes the guesswork and time consuming nature out of overclocking. If you have an overclockable K-SKU chip, it will gradually increase the power going to the CPU and the speeds it will run at. After each incremental increase, it runs a stability test in which the CPU is basically pushed to 100% for a sustained period of time. If it comes back that the CPU is indeed stable at this speed, it will then take it up again by the same small amount. It runs this in a loop until the CPU callout becomes unstable at a speed, in which case the software takes the CPU down to the last stable known speed. A really great, clever idea, and after all, who doesn't like free performance? Even with a heavy overclock, the beefy heatsinks kept the VRMs nice and cool, with initial gradual temperature increases which evened out and kept steady at that temperature. Given this is passive cooling, your results may vary depending on case airflow, and it can take longer to cool down, but the heatsinks are definitely more than adequate. Overall, this board is indisputably high-end. It doesn't hide away from that, and why should it? It has the feature set to justify its price point, and the real question has to be for you, the consumer and the buyer, as to whether you will use a large enough portion of the features on this board in order for it to warrant your cash. And this is the point I praise ASUS, massively in fact. You couldn't ask for more features on a board that you'd be surprised to hear isn't even their highest end spec. The design spot on, and whilst the IO plastic cover feels a tad flimsy and doesn't really contribute anything technically to the motherboard apart from aesthetics, no element of the design compromises the RGB colour personalisation, a mistake other manufacturers seem to make way too frequently. Overall, this has proved itself to be a superbly designed, unapologetically overkill motherboard with a feature set no one can complain at. Will you be splashing your cash on this ASUS motherboard? Let me know in the comments section below. Subscribe if you wish, drop a like rating, tweet me at GeekaWhat, but as always, we'll see you in the next GeekaWhat video.